We'll tour the French medieval town of Castelgard and its castle, which you see here. The year is 1357. It's the height of the 100 Years' War between France and England, which actually lasted slightly more than 100 years, although fighting often stopped for decades at a time. This is a world very different from our own, so let's take a moment and see why. This is the Europe we know today. France here, England here. Two independent nations which have traditionally been bitter enemies. But 600 years ago, France and England were very close. This is the world of 1357. England, an island conquered by the French in 1066, has strong ties to France. Nobles in England speak the French language, follow French customs. And England owns a large part of France, about a third of the entire country, around Bordeaux, which is a major English port. England has owned these lands for generations, but France now views England as a foreign power occupying its territories, and wants the land back. England, in retaliation, brings its armies to France and devastates the country for years on end. Our town of Castelgard is here, in the frontier region of the Dordogne River. One side of the river is French, the other side English. The fighting rages back and forth, intermittent and very bloody. At the moment, Castelgard is in the hands of the English, but that may change at any time. With that background, let's pay a visit to the town before we go to the castle. While we tour Castelgard, we'll have a little scavenger hunt at the same time. As you explore the town, you'll find scrolls like the one straight ahead. If you approach it, you can click on it. Go ahead and do that. The scroll will provide more information about the town. See if you can find all the scrolls. You might find some surprises too. Whenever you want to leave the scene, just press the escape key. Now let's go to the door and open it. Castelgard is a typical medieval town in the 14th century. If some parts look a little new and fortified, it's because they are. During the 100 Years' War, French towns beefed up their fortifications. Castelgard is built beneath a castle that protects it from above, and it has an outer wall surrounding the entire town as well below. This was usual during the period. Towns without walls didn't last long. The town is mostly deserted now because everyone's attending a tournament. Let's look around. These high walls mean business. Not only were England and France fighting in the 14th century, but there were many private wars between French and English nobles as well. Towns were often captured and pillaged and all the inhabitants killed. Even so, at this time towns were safer than the countryside. The forest was filled with cutthroat bandits, renegade knights, and rabid wolves. It was better to live in a town, and more people did. So in a way, it's the opposite of modern times, when we tend to think that it's safer to live in the country than in the city. Castelgard is built on a hillside, so it slopes steeply down. This makes the town easier to defend. Whenever possible, towns were built on hilltops, a practice that went back far before the 14th century. Castelgard is built on a hillside, so it slopes steeply down. This makes the town easier to defend. Whenever possible, towns were built on hilltops, a practice that went back far before the 14th century. Castelgard is built on a hillside, so it slopes steeply down. This makes the town easier to defend. Whenever possible, towns were built on hilltops, a practice that went back far before the 14th century. This is the blacksmith shop. Looks like he's going to the tournament too. Blacksmiths were found everywhere at this time, not only to fashion wrought iron, but more important, to shoe horses. Horses are important not only for farming, but for fighting. If an army runs out of horseshoes, then the army is literally hobbled. That happened once to the English a few years back. Their army had to avoid battles until they could get their horses shod. So there's a great need for blacksmiths. The blacksmith works by hand, of course. Everything in the medieval world is handmade. If you really lived in this world, that's one of the biggest differences you'd notice. Nothing is manufactured. Everything is handmade, so everything is expensive. And consequently, even rich people don't own much in the way of personal possessions. You may have noticed that most of the house doors are above ground level. This was because the streets were usually filled with slops and sewage. You wanted your door to be above that. Sometimes the doors were up at the second floor, which was primarily done for defense in case the town was invaded. Blacksmiths worked only in iron. Steel making, for swords and armor, was a specialized process. Steel requires that the iron be melted and mixed with a small amount of carbon. This was done in a kind of oven, but during this time steel was of poor quality. It rusted, and it was brittle, so swords sometimes broke. These towns twist and turn because they've been built up over centuries. Buildings are close because whenever possible, pre-existing walls are shared with a new structure. Building a wall is a big undertaking. So as you look at the pattern of streets, you have to imagine that the town has built up over many centuries. It's more like a coral reef than anything planned. Actually, during the 100 Years' War, many new towns were built from scratch. They look completely different from a town like this. The new towns are called bastides, and they have straight streets on a grid pattern, like a modern city. But Castelgard is an old town, going back to the 9th century. We've made an inn for our game, but it's far bigger and grander than what you would have actually found in a town of this size. In reality, a town like Castelgard would have a stable near the outskirts, and a house with a tavern on the ground floor and some rooms on the second floor. That'd be it, if there was an inn at all. But we have a tournament here, so this inn is filled. If you go down here, you can catch a glimpse of the tournament itself. Tournaments were very popular in medieval times, both with combatants and spectators alike. But they had a reason for being. Kings and nobles hosted tournaments as a way to show off their wealth and the strength of their private armies. In times of peace, the king would hold many tournaments to keep his warriors busy fighting each other, so they didn't get into trouble. Tournaments eventually evolved into ceremonial pageants, but in the 14th century, they were as dangerous as any war. The fighting was real, and many knights died in tournament combat. You notice some of the brightly colored tents. To our eyes, they seem excessive and gaudy, but medieval people loved color and pageantry and spectacle. Everybody felt that way. This was a time when the sumptuary laws were passed, which restricted what clothing people could wear, sort of a medieval dress code. The sumptuary laws were passed because ordinary people were dressing so richly that the nobles were beginning to feel the competition. If you were a noble lord, it wouldn't do for the town merchant to go around wearing more fur collars and necklaces and finger rings than you were. So the sumptuary laws were meant to put people in their place. Of course, as with dress codes everywhere, the laws didn't work. This little garden we're in is typical. Many town dwellers had small plots and grew food. Sometimes the food was sold. So these plots were part of the local economy, a way to make extra money. Often a merchant would have a still or a brewery in his house and make extra money that way. Usually the wife was in charge of these extra income-producing activities, along with her other duties. This town looks pretty clean. They've cleaned it up for the tournament, but even so, the streets would have been slippery with slops and garbage and waste from people and animals. You have to imagine what that would be like to walk in, and you have to imagine the smell. It's also true that towns were a place where infections could spread rapidly. In fact, the one time when towns were more dangerous than the country was during an epidemic. Then people fled from towns to the countryside. France has just suffered an epidemic of the plague a few years ago. The plague was devastating. It killed about a third of the population, in some places half. The infection was so severe that sometimes people would be walking down the street and just fall over dead. The infection was spread by lice, but it was also airborne, so you could just breathe it in. Most families lost some of their members, and many families were entirely wiped out. Farms were abandoned, buildings deserted. But as you see, there was a very rapid recovery. Partly because, in the wake of the plague, there were fewer people, so labor costs were higher. The survivors were better paid. You see the castle up there above us. The Lord lives there, with his private army of soldiers and knights. The town below is under his protection. I've said that new towns were built during this period. In fact, 1,000 new towns were built in France during the 14th century. You might wonder why. Defense was certainly one reason, but another reason was economic. For the noble in the castle, a town was a source of wealth. The nobility were expected to live grandly, entertain lavishly, and supply soldiers for fighting, all very expensive pursuits. So nobles always needed money, and what they principally owned was land. But if your land was forest, it didn't earn any money at all. If your land was farmland, it wasn't a big earner either. On the other hand, if you built a town, then there would be a lot of trade in the town. It would be a center of commerce, and you could tax the merchants. So the best use of your land was to make towns. You attracted people to live in your town by granting special dispensations and tax breaks. Often the town citizens were given the right of self-government, and in fact, these grants to towns were an important factor in bringing the feudal system to an end. You found them all. Well done. Now let's go have a look at the castle, and we'll see the tournament itself later on.